Hey there, welcome to today's episode. And as you can see, I'm doing another beat breakdown for my submission to the Conductor Williams Ears Sample Flip Beat Challenge, whatever you want to call it, number 4. I did one last month and I did a little video just showing you behind the scenes how I cooked up my beat. Last time I started off with a piece of hardware and then I showed you how I took that and then moved it into Ableton. But this month I was short on time, so what I did is I actually just started this entire project inside of Ableton. This was built in Ableton from the ground up. I don't really care if I use a DAW. I prefer hardware most of the time, so my MPC or whatever. But because of the time limitations, it's actually just a full Ableton project. This is going to be a live unedited session, and it's just so that I've got a record of this each month. I think it's kind of interesting to look back, see your process, what you did right, what you did wrong, and also for other members of the Patreon group and anyone who's just interested in beat making in general, you can see how I cooked up my idea. It was the same as always. You got 4 full-length records, 4 full samples. You can chop and choose between them. You can layer, you can mash them all up. There are no real rules. You can also, layer your own instruments and do all that kind of thing. It's a really fun competition, and if you want to be part of it, you need to go over to Conductor Williams Patreon, sign up over there. I'm not affiliated. I'm a paying member just like everybody else. But I do think it is worth, if you're into, beat, flip, sample making challenges, I do think it's worth taking part and becoming a member over there. So on the Ableton project, the first 4 tracks are just the samples. They were laid out so that I had access to them, of course, and then I could chop and choose. In the end, I decided to only go with a piece of sample 4. So the 4th, I think it was the 4th record in the pack that we were given. We don't get any titles or names, so I can't tell you what it is. To me, it sounds like something from a stage show. It's kind of, it sounds like someone quite young singing. A little bit like Oliver or something like that. Could be, I'm not a big theatre fan, but it sounds like that to me. I only chose the intro section of that particular record. This went on, it was a much longer sample, but I want to show you the piece of audio, so I've duplicated it down the bottom so you can hear the sample pre-chop. So let's take a listen to that, we'll get that set up. So that's the sample itself. What I'm going to do to keep the project file tidy, because this normally isn't in here, I'm just going to cut that out and then we can take a look at everything else. So on sample 4, that is the piece of audio that is inside of a simpler. If we click over there, and if you're unfamiliar with Ableton, simpler is basically just a slicing tool, the plugin that you can use in here to act like an MPC, put your sample chops in and mess around with them. So that is my chops, which would be on this first track. What I'll quickly do is just show you the beat. I'm not going to play the entire thing because I don't want to make the video too long, but I'll show you the individual sections. We'll just skim through and then we'll break it down a little bit further. But that's what we're kind of starting with here, is a simpler with the chops at the top. If I just play you some of the sections, I have an introduction section. Then we go into something that you would consider maybe like a first verse. It's pretty short, again, for the time limitations. I'm only using something like, what, we got 8 bars maybe. Then we have a breakdown, a second verse, if you will, and then like an outro, just real simple. Start with the introduction.
You don't make a music in the church. You could do it in the streets. You could do it at home. The rest is bullshit, and you know it. It's bullshit.
So that's my basic introduction. Usually when I'm putting a beat together, that's what I like. I want something that is leading you somewhere to move into this kind of fuller first verse where, you know, the kind of the meat and potatoes of the beat is, if you like. Basic sample chops. With Ableton, wherever you see these kind of different colored sections, and this is pretty standard practice, I'm sure, for most people with the AWs, but I'm marking out where things change. So we've got this repetition of sample chops here, where we've got this kind of sort of, I don't know, custardy yellow kind of color, is a different set of chops than where it's green and then a different color, like sort of greeny blue color. That is just where, yeah, variations of those chops are, just to keep things interesting. But that is the introduction. We've got a little vocal sample, got this vinyl static that's running throughout. And then as we get into the first verse, there's a small little drop in the introduction where the beat just drops out, like the drums come out. Little bit of a sort of, not necessarily a drum roll, but a little bit of like a little fill in before we kick into sort of the first verse. So let's take a quick listen to the first verse. And that leads us into what is like a breakdown. So the only things changing here, obviously the drums are switching up a little bit. The bass line kicks in this sort of first verse. I also added in this little vibraphone melodic thing, if you will. It's only a couple of notes, just something to kind of drive the beat along. And we had a little bit of like a crash, I think, to just kind of drive us into that first verse. The breakdown switches up a little bit, so the chops switch up. The drums go back to slightly more subtle drums, and I'll talk about those a little bit more when we kind of just dive a little bit further into the beat. But they switch up again as we come into the breakdown. The bass line changes. I also added in a little Rhodes piano, just something, a little riff that I put together. There's a one little very subtle trumpet sort of stab that leads you into the breakdown as well. So let's just take a quick listen to the break. And you can see then how that leads us into our second verse. Throughout all of this, the sample chops, just very small, subtle details will be switching up and changing. It's all of these just like little bits of that original sample where it's bits of like vocal singing, just chopped to create like, yeah, weird, random, abstract, not melodies as such, but you get the idea. That runs all the way through. The only difference in the second verse is that just as we get to sort of the 25th bar here, halfway through, I kind of double up on the little vibraphone sort of noise with just it's like a weird little, I called it end blip, so it must be like a little synth noise or something. Just play you a little bit of that just as that kicks in. You can hear it, it's almost like a whistly sort of sound. And then that leads us into the outro. And the outro is basically just a repetition of the intro. So the same sample chops, the drums go slightly more subtle, and then it just kind of fades out from there. The only difference being at the very end, you hear a little bit more of that sample play. So I'll just play you the outro real quick. Now on the final version, when this was like tracked out, I cut that a little bit shorter. It's got a nice little fade out. Also, in terms of like mixing and mastering, there was a sort of another mastering phase. After this had been bounced down, I did a bunch of work on mastering it and getting the lux levels up. There's probably a bunch of EQ in there. Because listening back to the original project file, it's a little bit dull. And I think my final output file, I tweaked the EQ, made it a little bit brighter. A few other things there. But that's the basic structure for the track, using only that one sample piece, using it to do a bunch of sample chops, move through the track, very basic structure. If we take just a quick look, there's only a couple of things I want to discuss really, and it's just sort of like the drums. When we take a look here, like I said before, different colors are for different sections, different things that's happening. These purple drums at the beginning, the introduction drums, pretty much the same as the main section. These are all programmed. I didn't want to use a loop or anything. So you can see all of that MIDI information, hopefully there, if we zoom in a little bit more. Bunch of kicks and snares, some ride cymbals. And that's kind of the big difference, is that in the introduction, I use like a really soft ride cymbal. So it's got a little bit of that noise kind of just coming along in the background. I wanted there to be more impact as it comes into like the first verse. So that's where the ride cymbals switch out and they become a little bit more raucous. And also when we get into the kind of main verses, we have sort of 3 bars of the same repetition of the drum break. And actually we can take a listen to that. And then as we get into sort of like the 4th bar, I put more of like an actual kind of like break beat kind of feel to it, just kind of programmed it that way. I'll give you a quick listen to that. Actually, let's listen just from here so you can hear the difference between the intro drums and then as they get a bit kind of more raucous into the first verse. You get the idea. So yeah, a little bit more kind of breakbeat on this 4th bar. You can hear we've also got a little bit of like cymbals like sort of chiming in just to kind of beef that up and give like the verses more impact. Other than that, not a huge amount to tell. If we take a quick look at the sample chops, I'll just show you some of the Ableton details, I guess. We've got the sample slices, so our simpler. I've got a little bit of delay on those slices, just so as they chop off, if they were short, there'd be like a little bit of delay in between, just fills things out. I'm bringing the stereo width down on the sample as well, just because I felt like it was panned a little bit one way or the other. If it's too wide, I've just narrowed that down. Not completely, it's not in mono, but it's a little bit more narrow. Got some automation going on the whole track. If we take a quick look, I'll be able to show you where the automation is. Yeah, so we've got a couple of little dips, just using like a low pass filter, just again to like fade out the sample chops before we get into like a verse, at the end of the breakdown before we get into the 2nd verse, just to give it some life, move things around a little bit. What else have we got in here? A little EQ on the main sample chops, just to carve out a bunch of the bass. There was quite a lot of bass frequencies in the sample, and I wanted to add my own bass line, so I just carved out a chunk there. Not too much, because I didn't want it to feel tinny or a bit thin, so we've just carved out a little bit there. The drums we've taken a look at. I'll show you what's on the drum channel itself. It's a drum rack, just to have all the drum samples in, using a little bit of reverb to just put all of the drums together into like a little bit of the same space. They're just random wave files, you know, these kicks and snares and things like that. So to group them together and make them feel like they were recorded in the same space, I've used a little bit of reverb on that whole, what we're talking about, the drum rack even. Then what I've got is a little R-Bass, which is a Waves plugin. That's adding a bunch of low end. So if I felt like the kick was a little soft and I wanted to up that, I'm probably using the R-Bass to accentuate like the fundamental frequencies of the kick. And then I'm using a standard clipper. So sometimes as well, if I just want to, mainly more for like my limiting and my max like lufs level later on, you can put like a standard clipper on your drums and bring them down. It can also give a little bit of like flavor to the drums as well, but nothing huge going on there. The bass line, we don't really need to discuss too much. It's very, very simple. I can play a small piece of that. Let's just do that. Not a lot going on there. I believe it's probably, I'm not sure actually what I use for the bass. Let's take a quick look. It's probably the Rickenbacker bass. I think that's a Native Instruments one. Filtered, so I filtered a bunch of the high end out, and I'm actually putting a little reverb on the bass line, but I'm keeping everything below certain hertz in mono, so still pretty centralized, but any slight higher frequencies be spread out a little bit there with just a little bit of a little bit of reverb. We had our little Rhodes piano for the breakdown. I'll play you that just so that you can kind of hear that on its own. Just wanted to give it something that, you know, kind of signified the breakdown, so things switched up. The bass line actually changes. It doesn't really sound too much like a bass at that point because I pushed the, it's kind of like coming up the octaves a little bit. I'll turn those on. And also there is a little trumpet noise, a little very subtle trumpet stab that just kind of comes in. I'll just play those three together. And obviously we've got different sample chops happening, and the drums go back to the kind of slightly more mellow part just before we get into the second verse where it all kicks off again. So really, that is pretty much all there is to talk about. There's a couple of little mild details in here. There's a little crash cymbal as the first verse comes in. This intro vocal was taken from a movie called Mean Streets, which is, I think that's a Scorsese movie if I remember right. Very cool movie, worth checking out if you haven't seen it. It's called Mean Streets. And that is pretty much it. We've got our little breakdown. I'll take you quickly through the master channel just in case there's anything to talk about there. Some compression. I'm using a utility here just to drop the gain. I've been feeling lazy and didn't want to bring all the sliders down inside of the mixer just to give myself some headroom. So I just used the gain plugin to drop everything down. A little bit of compression going on. A little bit of RC20, probably just to add like distortion, a little bit of noise, a couple of other things. Not using the Kramer tapes or the vinyl or the True Iron. And then just the Ozone 8 there where I was doing a little bit of like limiting and stuff towards the end. So that is generally it. As I said, there was a slightly more mastered version that would have been submitted for the beat. Usually I drop everything down. I like to work when I'm doing kind of like my final tweak and master. I like to do that on a bounce down audio file. So I would bounce this all down to one stereo file and then do some final EQing and tweaking, get my LUFS levels and everything else. Anyway, gonna leave it like that, and I will, hope you've enjoyed this video. Hope you like seeing the process like this. Let me know in the comments if you've done anything similar yourself, particularly the other Patreon members if you're over there and you want to do a beat breakdown for like, you know, what you did. I'm really interested in that kind of stuff. I really enjoy watching videos like this, so let me know in the comments if you've got something similar where I can see what you did with the samples. And I'll catch you guys next time. Take care, and I'll see you again.